Welcome back. In today's episode, we pick up with part 2 of the interview with Steve Robbins. Is there a way to evaluate risk, and what is EV, expected value? If you've ever wondered if something is worth it and what the risk is and what the upside is, this episode is for you. Sit back and enjoy.
Welcome to this edition of Peak Performance Podcast with your host, Thor Conklin. Thor will be sharing the necessary tools, strategies, and psychology you'll need to become a peak performer in any area of your life or business.
Thor Conklin here. We give you the tricks, the tips, the tools, the strategy, the technology, and the psychology peak performers use in order to get more done and execute at the highest level. If you know what to do but struggle with getting it all done, or simply want to raise your game to the next level, this podcast is for you. Sit back and enjoy. Risk adversity and EV. Now, I need you to explain this in layman's terms. For a lot of people, it's going to be a new concept. So let's try to make this as simplified as possible for the audience.
Sure. First of all, let's acknowledge that we live in a world where everything is risky. We never completely know the outcome of anything we do. We can be pretty sure, but stuff happens. It's called the rest of the world. It's called luck, whatever you want to call it. So we get the outcomes that we want with a certain probability. Now, the probability might be very, very high. The probability that if I put my garbage in the garbage can and leave it out on the curb on Tuesday night, that it will be gone Wednesday morning because the trashman will have picked it up, very, very high probability. It works almost all the time except when there's a holiday. But it's still not perfect. However, the way that our brains work is we tend to form rules that are generalizations. So the generalization becomes, put my garbage out and it'll get picked up. Most of the time, and for many, many things, this is great. Not a problem at all. It works. We are able to go about our lives, and we have a set of rules for how the world works that is imperfect, but it's good enough for us to be able to survive and get the results that we want. However, when you're talking about making major decisions that are either going to commit you for a lot of time or a lot of money or reputational risk or anything where there's a potential bad downside to it, a lot of times the way we're taught to evaluate such decisions is to make a list of the pros and the cons and to ask ourselves, do the cons outweigh the pros? And maybe we actually translate it into dollars or we don't or whatever. But essentially what we come down to is saying, how do the pros stack up against the cons? And then if there's enough pros, we choose the pros. We choose in that direction. The problem with this is it doesn't take into account the fact that the world is uncertain. There have been 4 decisions that I have made in my life, which at the time that I made them with the information that I had available seemed to be very reasonable decisions. And if I could undo those 4 decisions, I would be sitting in a mansion somewhere, in one of my mansions right now, on any one of a number of continents, having flown there in my private plane. These were all decisions that cost me huge amounts of money. And I have always looked for, why is it that I made the decisions that in hindsight turned out to be wrong? Now again, at the time, so one case, I was the co-founder of a company. The company went public, and I had to make the decision whether or not to sell my shares. And I decided to sell them at a particular price at a particular time. And that was long ago. That was a few decades ago. And every time I revisit that decision, I always come to the same conclusion, which is, darn it, given the same information today, I would still sell the shares. Now, as it turns out, had I kept the shares, I would have had about $7 or $8 million in the bank. But I didn't keep them. I sold them for $200,000. It was enough money to pay off my student loans, but that was about it. And I have always looked for, how is it that I could have made the right decision? There has to be some way that would have at least nudged me in the direction of making the right decision, or the decision that in hindsight would be right. Because if I'd done that once, I would say, okay, maybe it was just luck. Maybe I made what really was the right decision, but luck got in the way. But this has happened 4 times. And I say, you know what? If it happens once, it might be luck. But if it's happened 4 times, it's probably because I'm not thinking about things the right way. Then I read an article entitled Millionaire's Math by a man named Billy Murphy, whose website is foreverjobless.com. And it talks about a concept called expected value. Now, of course, the irony is I learned this concept in business school in 1989, but they never taught us where and how to use it. They just taught us the concept, so I never connected it with my decision-making process. Here's the idea. If something is unlikely to happen, or if it's likely to happen to the point where it's virtually certain or virtually impossible, then it doesn't really matter. You can treat it as an absolute. But if something may or may not happen, then when you think about it, if something may or may not happen, you need to take into account your estimation of the probability of it happening when you compare it against other alternatives. So for example, if let's say that I have a choice, I can buy a new car or I can can buy a used car. And the used car is going to be half the price of the new car, but the used car does not come with a warranty, and the new car does. And let's say the new car is $1,000. Let's say the new car is $10,000 and the used car is $5,000. So that's an interesting question. Should I buy the $5,000 used car with no warranty, or should I buy the $10,000 car with a warranty? Well, that depends upon how likely I think it is that the used car is going to break down. If I think it's really likely that it's going to break down and need more than $5,000 worth of repairs, then I should certainly buy the new car instead. If I think that neither car is going to break down, then I should certainly buy the used car. So how do I approach this problem? And what I do is I assign probabilities to each of the outcomes. So in this case, let me say that I'm going to simplify the decision a little bit because I don't want to get too complicated and without a whiteboard in front of me where I could draw things. But let's say that I think there is a 50-50 chance that in the next 3 years, the used car will require a total of $5,000 worth of repairs. So 50-50 chance that within 3 years, the used car will require $5,000 worth of repairs. And I think that there is a 0% chance that the $10,000 car will require any repairs. And if it does, it's covered by the warranty, so that's the equivalent of not needing a repair. It's not going to be any money out of my pocket. So instead of comparing $5,000 maybe-ish wishy-washy with $10,000, I say $10,000 with a 100% likelihood, 0% likelihood of needing repairs, 100% likelihood that it won't need repairs, so 100% likelihood of me getting a fully functioning car for 3 years, that's worth $10,000. But a $5,000 car, which has a 50% chance of needing an additional $5,000 worth of repairs, I have an additional $5,000 worth of repairs, and I think there's a 50% chance of that. So I multiply those two together and I get $2,500 worth of repairs. So I say this car is $5,000 out of pocket plus $2,500 worth of repairs. On average, $2,500 worth of repairs. So the expected value of the repairs is $2,500 because that's 50% times the amount of money that I think I'm risking. I'm risking, right?
Yep.
And then I add on the $5,000 purchase price because there's a 100% probability that I'm going to pay the purchase price to acquire the car. So now, instead of comparing a $5,000 car with all this uncertainty with a $10,000 car, I've simplified both numbers and I've now factored in the probabilities, and now I'm comparing a $7,500 car with a $10,000 car. And I'll say, you know what? The $7,500 car is still cheaper. Even though there's a chance that I'll end up having to pay $10,000 out of it, there's also a chance that I'll end up only having to pay $5,000. So the theoretically correct solution, if you're using expected value there, is to buy the $7,500 car because it's cheaper. And in both cases, you'll get 3 years of use out of the cars. This is an expected value calculation. What it does is it takes the probability of the different outcomes into account, and you take that into account when you're comparing outcomes. The reason this is important is that most people, and we talked about risk-taking before, but most people don't correctly assess risk. They look at outcomes that have a low probability of failure, but a very high value of failure. So, oh my gosh, I might lose, there's a 5% chance I'll lose $100,000. I don't want to take that risk. That's better thought of as there is an expected value of that risk of 5% times $100,000, which is of minus $5,000. So properly adjusted for risk, that particular option should be valued as a $5,000 loss, not as a $100,000 loss. So let me give you a really concrete example of a stupid investment that I totally missed. I was thinking about investing in real estate, and I found a rental building in an area of town that needed about $150,000 worth of work. And I looked at this, and I made the following incorrect assessment. I said, well, I'm going to buy the building, then I'm going to put in $150,000. If it turns out that's not enough money to fix the things that are wrong, well, now I'm out $150,000, and I still don't have a building that I can rent out. Whereas, if I don't buy the building, then I get to keep my $150,000. So I'm like, I just don't want to take the risk. I don't want to take the risk of ending up $150,000 in a hole and not having a building because of it. So there were two errors with that calculation. One error is it didn't take into account the idea that I could resell the building. And even if I resold it just for what I had bought it for, the total amount I would have lost would have been $150,000, not $150,000 plus the purchase price. So thinking of it as now I'm going to be stuck with a non-performing building, that was the wrong way to think about it. It would have been now I can sell the building and I will have lost just the money I put into the repairs. However, if you had asked me, what do you think the chances are that you're going to spend $150,000 and that won't be enough? I would have said, well, based on the assessments that I've gotten, based on the people that I've talked to, I would say there's probably a 25% chance that it'll go over, it'll be a cost overrun. Now that sounds like a lot, except if we think in terms of expected value, we say, what's 25% of 150,000? And I actually don't know that off the top of my head, but I can type it in because I have a computer. That's $37,500. Now, I would still lose that. In fact, I might lose the whole 150. You don't know because, but what we're saying is that viewed from an expected value measurement, I shouldn't be thinking of this as a $150,000 risk. I should be thinking of it most properly as a $37,000 risk. And if I had thought of it that way, I would be then when I went to do my pro con, I would say, well, it's a $37,000 risk, but this is a building that will generate more than $37,000 a year in rental income. So if I had thought about it that way, I would have said, holy cow, of course I'll take this. To spend $37,000 to get an ongoing revenue stream of $37,000? Yeah. Absolutely. Now, keep in mind, there's still the 25% chance that I'll have to put in the whole $150,000. And yeah, that would be bad. I'd lose $150,000. But that doesn't mean it was a bad decision because I made the decision by taking properly into account my estimation of risk. If you do this consistently, what will happen is you will start to take risks that you otherwise would not have taken. So in this case, I would take what was a $150,000 risk, which in reality I didn't take because I didn't know how to factor in expected value. But if you factor in expected value and if you get your probabilities, roughly in the right range, then what happens is over time you are essentially identifying which opportunities have a high enough payoff given the various probabilities that it's worth taking that risk. And you roll the dice and if you roll the dice enough times and you're consistently making positive expected value decisions, then eventually one will pay off.
And in that example, if you put $150,000 in repairs, you may actually recoup some of that if you had to sell the building in the sale. You may get some of that back.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I totally botched my analysis of that. Yeah. And the two ways I botched it, one is I didn't take into account the resale value, and two, and any possible improvement to the resale value, and two is I just didn't look at the probabilities. This is one of the interesting things about employment. If someone is making a decision, should I keep my nice, safe job or should I strike out and start my own company? And you think about that decision as a expected value decision, well, the expected value of keeping your job, unless you have an equity upside in the job, is basically just your salary. It's actually probably not 100% unless you work for a very large company that for some reason never does layoffs. But so you say, okay, let's say I'm making $100,000 a year. That is the value. That is the maximum expected value of my job is $150,000 a year, or $100,000 a year. If I strike out to start my own company, let's say I think I have a 20% chance of success. But in the case of but if I define success as being able to exit within 5 years with $10 million, and if I have some reason to believe the odds are really as high as say 10% of that. Well, 10% times 10 million is $1 million. And that's a higher expected value. That actually, the math on that doesn't work because if we're talking about a 10-year time frame, 10 years worth of $100,000 salary is $1 million. So in that case, it's equivalent. But if you use the real numbers that a lot of people have, what you find is that the interesting thing about employment is employment fixes your expected value of staying at whatever your compensation package is. Whereas leaving your job to do something, if you're doing something that has a lower probability of a very high payoff, the expected value may often be to start the company, to leave your secure job and start the company. Doesn't mean you'll succeed. It just means that the expected value is higher, which means over time, if you keep rolling that particular dice, eventually you'll hit something.
The numbers will be in your favor.
Right. And when you're talking about something like entrepreneurship, the more you get out there and do stuff, the more you go up the learning curve. So the next time your probability of success isn't going to be 1 in 10. Your probability of success is going to be maybe 1 in 7. And if while you're doing that business, you discover, oh, people really want green widgets, not blue widgets, I'm going to go start a green widget company. Now your probability is probably 1 in 2, especially if you've used that the time with that previous venture to make all of the contacts that you're going to need to make the next thing succeed. So each thing you do is going to make certain things more likely to succeed in the future and certain things less likely to succeed. And if you take the probabilities into account and keep iterating over time, you will roll the dice, and there's still the chance you could be really, really unlucky and always roll a losing roll. But over time, you will tend to roll more and more winning rolls. And so that's the difference between expected value. What expected value gives you is a way to understand that a downside may not be as low as it is, as you think it is, or as down as you think it is. And actually, for that matter, an upside may not be as up as you think it is.
Give me some example or some guidance. I know in my particular case where I've really messed up is I haven't properly identified in some cases what the true risk was. It was, I got optimistic. The risk isn't going to be that much. The downside's not going to be that much. How does this formula enter into that equation?
Well, so in terms of assessing the risk, that really is the tricky part, is assessing what is the probability. For that, you want to do as much research as you can. Some things you can find really good data. So if you had no other data, let's say you were going to go start your own startup company and say, I have no idea what the chances are that I will ever exit with $1 million or not, you could actually just go get overall failure rates for startups. That information is available. And you can say, well, there were 60,000 startups last year and 30% of them failed. Okay, so in the absence of any better data, that I'll at least survive. Say 60% of them survive a year. Or 66%. So right off the bat, you have a 30% chance of failure, 60% chance of success. And then over the 60% chance of success, you can look for some data, and I'm not quite sure, I don't know if private companies can't be tracked to this level, but you can go out and try to get some idea of what percentage of the surviving 2/3 actually makes it to $1 million and how long does it take. But so you can find rough probabilities that way.
What I found, I had the purchase price of the company, but what I didn't figure in was the amount of money that I was going to pour into the company over the next 7 years. And that was the piece that came back to bite me.
Right. Well, and that comes on the cost side of the equation because both the revenues and the costs have expected values associated with them. So what I've done when I've evaluated different opportunities for businesses or for some sort of investment is I usually come up with 5 or 6 scenarios, and I call one of them the best case scenario, and I evaluate that using assuming that I have low expenses and high revenues. I have a worst case scenario where I really crank up the expenses and lower the revenue value. Then I have a bunch of medium scenarios that have different mixes. And then what I assign is the probability to each one of those scenarios as a whole. So I say, you know what? I think there's maybe a 5% chance of all of the stars aligning, and we will have really low costs and we'll be able to go right out and sell 100,000 of these. And I think there's about a 5% chance that we'll end up in that dream scenario. Whereas I think there's about a 40% chance that we're going to end up in the scenario where our costs are double what we think they're going to be and our revenues are a third of what we think they're going to be. And I assign the probabilities that way, and I assign the probability to the entire scenario. So I value each scenario, then I assign the probability, and then I find out, adjusted for probability, which does it still make sense to do this? So there was a startup that I had the opportunity to invest in, and I did this type of portfolio analysis, and I gave the failure scenario a 60% chance of happening. Now, if I were using normal decision making, I would never have given that a shot. I wouldn't have put money in. Because I would have said a 60% chance of failure. Of course not. Why would I do that?
Right.
Well, the answer is because of the expected value. Because even though the chances for success were slim, if success happened, it would have been worth a lot of money relative to what I was putting in.
Brilliant. This is a great formula.
Well, and expected value-wise, the expected value, even when I played with the numbers a whole bunch, the expected value still kept coming out to, you know what, a small chance of success in this case is still worth enough to justify the investment. And I put the money in, and we hit the failure scenario, and I lost it. But unlike those other 4 decisions, this one I don't feel bad about.
Right.
Because this one I understood, I correctly factored in all of the risk factors, I correctly factored in the probabilities of success, I rolled the dice, and guess what? It happened to come up snake eyes.
Yeah, this is what angel investors do.
Yes.
They're taking a bet on 20, hoping that 1 or 2 hits it.
Precisely. And you need to think about that with respect to your own decisions. This all really, now I learned the expected value and how to apply it in life from this gentleman, Billy Murphy. But when I think all the way back to my entrepreneurship professor in business school, one of the things he said to all of us is he said, you should be asking yourself, am I taking enough risks? And he said, ask yourself that regularly, because the answer is almost certainly no.
Yeah.
And now, what he didn't do was tie that to expected value. And I really wish he had, because if he had said, here's one way to find out if you're taking enough risks, do these expected value calculations, and, would have changed my life. But the basic sentiment is actually still the basic sentiment is still there, which is, are you taking enough risks? Risks defined as positive, going after positive expected value things. And there's another piece that I would add here, given that most entrepreneurs are risk averse, which is do factor in risk of ruin. Because if this 60%, if the investment that had the 60% chance of complete failure had been all of my remaining cash, and that would have left me in a place where I couldn't make additional bets for the future, then that would not have been a prudent bet to make, because that 60% risk of failure carried with it a very, very highly negative expected value of future investments after this one.
Yep. Great information. That concludes part 2 of our interview with Steve Robbins. Please tune in later this week for part 3. Being a peak performer is all about execution. Think of those people that you know that you consider peak performers. Some have had great plans. Some are really smart. Some just have natural talent. And others are highly educated. But the one thing that they all have in common, and I don't even know who you're thinking about, they all know how to execute. If they can't execute, they would not be considered a peak performer. Everybody has dreams, but peak performers actually execute them. This applies on the field, in athletics, or in the boardroom. If you're a business owner, a coach, an entrepreneur, or a corporate executive, and you're frustrated and tired of knowing what to do, but you just can't seem to get it all done, or your results are inconsistent, or maybe you're really good at execution, but your team doesn't know how to execute. Are you missing budget? Are you working 80 hours a week and it seems like you're just banging your head up against the wall every day? I know I've been there. Are you not making the kind of money that you want and deserve? I have a program that just might be the answer for you. This program is not for everyone. We go deep, we get raw, we get real. But if you're truly committed to mastering execution, and for the first time, truly being able to execute on what you know, as opposed to just trying to figure out more information and looking for that secret, we will teach you to become a master of execution. We'll teach you the science of getting things done. Simply take your phone and text the word BE Summit, one word, to 41411. That's Business Execution Summit. The keyword, BE Summit, that's what you text, and text it to 41411. Remember, it's not what you know. It's not even who you know. It's about what you're able to execute. That's what truly matters. Don't let another month, another quarter, or another year slip by with just average results. Text today. Thank you for listening. If you haven't already done so, please head over to iTunes and subscribe to the show. Also, please share this with family, friends, coworkers, or anyone that could benefit from this information. To make it very easy to share these episodes, simply go to my Facebook page, Thor Conklin, click on the episode that you want to share, and you can post it to your timeline. You just might be helping one of your friends on Facebook by sharing it on your page. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Thor Conklin. The website is thorconklin.com. The email is info@thorconklin. While at the website, please sign up for our weekly newsletter with additional tricks, tips, tools, and psychology on how to be a peak performer. Remember, these episodes are anywhere between 6 and 35 minutes and are meant to be consumed during dot time doing other things. Until tomorrow, have an absolutely amazing day.